Aventurine goes all in, and so do I. Today I'm gonna show you how to build this colorful peacock with crippling gamba addiction best. Let's start with his relics. This IPC tax agent, who also looks like he has a side hustle in the pimp industry,
Hey girlie, hold still.
has two major routes to offer how to build him. Either ballsy damage or go all in on his defensive utility. Therefore, the whole build part of this guide will focus on both directions. If you go for damage, then the dice falls on the 4-piece Pioneer Diver set, which will be your best bet. The 12% increased damage from the 2-piece is always welcome, and the whole set keeps on giving very useful stats of 4% crit rate and up to 12% crit damage if your team manages to get 3 debuffs on the enemies. And since Aventurine can apply his own debuff with his burst, you even get double of the aforementioned values. But listen, the piece says double bonus for inflicting debuffs, and only one turn at a time. So, and Gamba Boy can only inflict a debuff with his burst, or when he breaks an enemy with his follow-ups, for example. So be aware that the uptime of that bonus will not be 100% and is heavily dependent on the number of enemies you face with imaginary weaknesses. Unless you run his signature Lightcone, of course. Then he gets to enjoy 100% uptime. Also, the trend of the Universal Market LC stacks the cards heavily in his favor to keep his bonus for most of the time. It's still his best set to party hard, but you know, enough waffling of this set. 4-piece Genius is no surprise that it is number 2. It's just universal for pretty much any DPS, even though the 2-piece is dog shit for most of them. So if you face lots of quantum weak enemies and you got a spare one in your mother's basement, use it. But if you run out of Gamba luck with your foes, it will be a bottom feeder set. Not very consistent and not very cash money. Just go and farm more Diver. 4-piece Wastelander is also a pretty obvious pick for him, no surprise. I hate to farm it too, as you get the Firesmith pieces, which to me feel hella outdated. If you got nothing else to work with, just go for 2-piece combos of Diver plus either Wastelander or Knight, or combine 2-piece Wastelander with 2-piece Knight. For the full-on defensive mode, you will go for piece Knight. It gives him extra defense and toughens his personal shield. This is the ultimate, I don't want to get hurt, so I will max out my defense option. That is an actual anime title, by the way, and a fun watch on top. Thank me later. Anyways, if all what you want is survivability and some decent damage, then you are right with this one. At the end of the day, his damage scales heavily with defense, but as you can see, it ranks last in the damage chart. In my opinion, your Trailblaze power is so much better invested into farming the Diver domain, so I consider Knight in this day and age as a noob trap. But if you're an actual noob or newbie, then surviving is actually a top priority after all, so there's also that. Now, for his 2-piece sets, if you want to go damage, you go Inat Solsato. Sigonia is only worth if you can get consistently 5 stacks or more. For supporting your DBS, go Broken Keel. While the Bellobox set gives you the fattest shields, it's inconvenient to farm. Broken Keel is overall the best and is needed in so many teams. But if you struggle with life and the hustle as a new player, it will serve you well for the time being.
Thank you.
Our Gambler Boy might feel the need for speed, but in fact, he actually won't need no speed moccasins at all. It's useful, but he can get away without it. It's just better to beef up his damage and shields. Also, Aventurine will take his sweet 4 turns to get his ult back anyway. This leaves us with building 3 defense pieces on his relics and use crit damage for his body. And since he boosts his own crit rate, he will be showered with juicy crit stats. For his balls, you would slightly deal more damage going for imaginary, But seriously, it's just way easier to get a defense piece for almost the same impact. Unless you are somehow very lucky, just don't get sweaty over it. To get him to 100% uptime, you would need to build an ERR robe and speed boots, which will certainly weaken his defensive capabilities. I do not think this is the optimal way of playing him. It's better just to time the bulk of your team's damage in that 3-turn window of Aventurine's burst to deal with a boss and have better survival on top. His crit rate increase is also very affected by the amount of defense you build, so the incentive here is clearly on building more defense over speed and energy recharge. In terms of substats, you want to go defense over crit damage, crit rate and then speed. If you get some HP and some effect rest here and there for survivability, it won't be a deal breaker. Sometimes fate is simply unjust, but that is not the case when we talk about his signature Lightcone. It's a decent upgrade for him and his team's damage output, as it debuffs enemies and on top gives Aventurine great stats, but it's not that strong to a point that it feels unfair at all. And for his shielding, it just trades blows with S1 moment of victory. So if you cursed your luck in the past for getting Gepard's Lightcone, then now bask in sweet vindication. And what makes this happenstance even better is that victory is the second best choice for his damage department too. So fate really works in mysterious ways after all. Enjoy your dub. However, if you are still gambling for a decent Lightcone, you can go with S5 Destiny's Threat that you can get from the shop for more damage. And S5, this is me if your pockets have some crumbs left for a battle pass. Sorry, but pretty much all the next choices are gacha until you reach the middle of the pack with Texture of Memories, which you will have to settle for if all you want is defense. Especially if you are still dwelling in the early game, but for most players, a moment of victory or destiny will be king. Ah yes, before I forget it, if you whip your big PP damage Acheron on the field, consider putting Universal Market on your Aventurine. So far, it's clear that Aventurine is a far shot from a pure sustain unit like Loacher or Gepard. You get clearly some offensive abilities from his own damage and the vulnerability he adds to a main target. The way his kit is positioned gives you incentive to play him with other follow-up attackers, but it's only an edge, not the whole package. In his core, he is still a sustain unit and technically useful in any team except Blade. That guy is on the unreachable side, just don't bother. But yeah, as you might have guessed, the IPS Tax Debt Collector Wombo combo of Aventurine, Topaz and Doctor Ratio will be best in slot. Throw on top a random Runmei and you're ballin'. And even more so when you put on Elation in the Simulated Universe. You all ain't ready for that. But yeah, in this team, he can play to all of his strength. But outside of them, any type of crit-based team will see huge benefits. Big example, Acheron. Imagine her, Black Swan, Pella, and now this dude. With the vulnerability debuff he brings to the table, Acheron can now nuke the chunkiest bastard on the field even faster, as if she isn't broken enough. Plus, that same debuff gives another stack to Acheron's burst. And since Blonde Gamba Boy is a preservation unit, he can make a ton of use of the Universal Market Lightcone, so he can get even more stacks for Acheron. So really good choice for that team. But Acheron aside, you can also pair him with Jingliu, Imbiber Lune, etc, etc. And while there are way better picks for no Acheron DOT teams, you still can put him there and have some benefit. Mostly from the elemental coverage you gain and of course from the sustain. But he will not in 1,000 years beat Huo there. He might be a slight upgrade over the likes of Bailu and Locha, as he makes your team deal better with crowd control debuffs and DOTs, while adding his own damage. This guy is good enough to blow traits with Fushuan in terms of sustain. So basically a highly capable unit in almost any case. If you're lacking a second good sustain, he's definitely your man. Alright, let's start with his kit. Dude is an imaginary preservation unit who has quite some similarities to Gepard. But of course, in the plain old Honkai tradition, Aventurine is gonna have a big lag over him. Starting with his normals, they are already different from most other sustained units. Instead of scaling with attack like everybody and their grandmother, Best Boy's slaps scale with defense percent. This is incredible because everything important, may it be offensive or defensive, scale from the same stat. And unlike Pink Gremlin, his normals will actually be worth something as he offers crit stats and gets even more from his build. His skill Cornerstone Deluxe is where his meat is, and his follow-ups. We will be going there too in a second. It provides all allies with a so-called fortified major shield that scales with defense. It's about half as strong as Gepard's shield, but unlike him, it can be casted more often. On top, it can stack up to about double its strength when you cast the skill again, which finally puts it about Gepard's strength. This can be useful if you expect a lot of damage incoming at once. The shield will last you for 3 turns, so pay attention how often your teammates go, or you will be in for a rude awakening when your Ting Yun with her global taunt gets smacked to death. Talking about shielding power, Aventurine has more access to defense than Gepard from his build and therefore can have even slightly beefier shields. Aventurine's ultimate Roulette Shark is a single target nuke that deals imaginary damage and scales also with his defense. It doesn't just deal damage, but also has him to generate 1 to 7 stacks of blind bet randomly for his follow-up attacks. But more importantly, the burst applies a vulnerability debuff to a single enemy for 3 turns. What it does is whenever a teammate deals a critical strike to an enemy, the enemy will take more damage from that hit. So don't get bamboozled when it mentions crit damage, as this number in his stats won't change, but the damage your team deals will. Shit loaded right is Aventurine's talent, and that one is packed. Whenever shields are up on your team, they get a whopping 50% effect res. This is pretty nice as that will automatically get any support who uses the Broken Keel set guaranteed over the 30% threshold. But more importantly, it's very useful to protect your team from crowd control and debuffs. And Aventurine himself can completely ignore his ass getting crowd controlled, at least for once, and then every 2 turns. So that is crucial to prevent your team ending up in a blue screen of death. But that isn't all with the goodies. Whenever anybody of your team gets hit by an enemy, when they have Aventurine's shield on, they will generate a blind bet stack for Aventurine's follow-up attacks. It doesn't matter if multiple guys of your team are hit at the same time, each of them will generate a stack. Once you reach 7 stacks, Aventurine will unpack his big boy follow-up attack, unleashing a 7-hit combo that bounces randomly among enemies. This ability, like all his others, does deal imaginary damage and scales with his defense. Interestingly, his stack counter goes up to 10 though, not to 7. So overcapping can easily happen, especially when multiple people are hit or he uses his burst. In these cases, the overflow stack similar to Acheron gets transferred to the next follow-up. This allows Aventurine to unpack multiple follow-up attacks in a pretty quick fashion, and frequency is quite important as a combined 175 multiplier for a single target isn't overwhelmingly huge, but it adds up if you can manage to make him go off the rails a lot, so it's pretty nice after all. The technique is solid for Aventurine. It gives your whole team a buff to their defense, and it comes down to chance if you get the base buff, the medium buff, or the maximum deluxe buff. However, there's no point in continuously rolling technique points on him just to try and get the max buff, since even his base buff at 24% is just alright. No Aventurine without some extra layers of Gamba, I guess. Now let's talk about Cash and Ascension traces. With his A2, we get that massive crit rate thing. Dude gets flat out up to 48% crit rate, which scales from his defense. So this gives a really strong incentive to give his damage some consideration. You pretty much only need that crit damage body and a shit ton of defense elsewhere to get him going. The A4 is also very good, as that gives your whole team a nice set of fresh shiny shields right at the beginning of the battle, and that without spending a single technique point, unlike Gepard. Really good against shitty guys that can't wait their freaking turn and just jump straight into your face. His A6 is pretty stacked. Whenever your teammates with a shield on launch a follow-up attack, Aventurine gets another stack to his blind bats, but you get only 3 at max from the team until Aventurine takes his next turn. Another really important thing is that whenever Aventurine himself deals a follow-up attack, you can see the shields on teammates being fortified. The effect is not as strong as that from his skill, but it is noticeable, and the unit who has the weakest shield gets an even stronger boost. I mean, you have to look out for your friends. Don't let them die on the streets.
I got you, homie!
Aventurine's Eidolons are clearly tailored to emphasize his damage or that of his team, so he basically becomes a preservation with a big touch of erudition and harmony. So in return, this means if you only want him as a sustain, you are pretty much done with him at E0. You don't need to gamble any further or sign any deals where you don't come out on top, but if you're out for damage, then that's a whole different conversation. At E6, his personal damage will be almost quadrupled from his E0 state, and the whole team deals now a whopping 40% more damage. Note that the numbers are done with an E0 Acheron, E6 Pella and E0 Black Swan team. Of course, if I had to dump a liver's worth of money on a unit, I would not prioritize the sustain over Acheron, but let's just roll with it to understand his own Eidolon value. Good stopping points would be E2, E4 and then his E6 of course. But let's go over them one by one. E1 gives a 20% crit damage increase to all allies who have his shield on. And on top, the ultimate now will also give allies his fortified wager shield equal in strength to the one the skill gives, and it lasts for the same amount of time, 3 turns. A solid 5% increase of his personal damage and 4% for the team. If you are now thinking if you should get this or his Lightcone, the answer would be the Lightcone if you seek more damage, and then climb the Eidolon ladder. With his E2, basic attacks of Aventurine will reduce all types of enemy resistances by 12% for 3 turns. Really helpful to deal with tough bastards. A 12% increase for Aventurine and his team from the previous Eidolon. E3 gives 2 levels to his ultimate and 1 to his basic attacks. A 4% increase for Aventurine and 0.35% for the team from E2. His E4 increases his own defense by 40% for 2 turns when Aventurine uses his follow-up attacks. Also, instead of hitting a random enemy for 7 times, you do now for 10. A 34% increase for Aventurine's damage and 3% for the team from the previous Eidolon. E5 raises his skill and talent by 2, 6% for Aventurine and 0.7% for the team from E4. E6 of course is the biggest fish here. This one gives up to 150% damage dealt bonus to Aventurine, a stat that he solely lacks in his kit or builds, so it ends up being a massive boost to his damage. In fact, increasing his damage output by 118% from the previous Eidolon and even affecting the whole Acheron team by 14%. I mean, it's an E6. It's expected to be busted, but yeah. So all in all, his Eidolons certainly have a profound impact on him, but outside of Wales, Anybody else will most likely just steer clear of them, as other things have just way more priority. Alright, our Gamba Boy looks really solid, to the point that he is on par with Fushuan in what he offers to the team, but is distinct enough to not straight up take the job away from the pink gremlin. If you're still looking for a new sustain, then he will be your man. This has been Neostar Impact. Peace.